The silence that fell across Thornfield Mansion's grand dining room on the evening of November 26, 1857, was unlike any silence Eleanor Blackwell had ever experienced, not the peaceful quiet of satisfied dinner guests, but rather the terrifying hush of people watching death unfold in real time before their horrified eyes. 30 minutes into the elaborate Thanksgiving feast that Eleanor had orchestrated with meticulous precision to demonstrate her mastery of hospitality and her unquestionable position within Savannah's elite planter society, the first guest collapsed violently from his chair, his body convulsing as aconite alkaloids flooded his bloodstream and disrupted the electrical conductivity of his heart muscle. By the end of the night, 52 of Georgia's most powerful men, state legislators, federal judges, plantation owners of extraordinary wealth, militia commanders responsible for security across entire regions, would be dead or dying from poison that had been carefully integrated into nearly every dish served during what was supposed to be Eleanor's triumphant celebration of her social authority. The architect of this catastrophe was a woman who had worked invisibly in Eleanor's kitchen for 3 years, a woman whose position as enslaved cook had made her so unremarkable in Eleanor's perception that the plantation mistress had never bothered to truly see her beyond the function she performed. Eveline Mason, 31 years old, born in New Orleans to a mother who had escaped Haiti's revolutionary chaos, carrying botanical knowledge that would eventually become instrument of devastation against Georgia's white elite, had spent 3 years planning the moment that would arrive on that November evening when revenge served on fine china would transform Eleanor's moment of triumph into Georgia's greatest nightmare. If you are absolutely ready to hear the most incredible story of sophisticated poisoning conspiracy ever orchestrated by an enslaved woman, how Eveline trained multiple conspirators across plantation boundaries without being discovered, how she calibrated aconite dosages based on victim body weight and anticipated food consumption patterns, how she integrated deadly toxins into feast preparations so seamlessly that no white observer detected anything wrong, and how she disappeared into Georgia's wilderness, leaving authorities scrambling to explain how property that was supposed to be invisible could orchestrate mass murder of the most powerful white men in the state. Then hit that subscribe button right now with force. Give this video a like that the algorithm will appreciate. Hand comment telling me exactly where you are watching from, because this story challenges absolutely everything white supremacy claimed about enslaved people's intelligence, capability, and capacity for sophisticated planning and coordinated resistance. Eveline's story began not in Georgia, but in the fever-soaked streets of New Orleans in 1826, born to Celeste, a woman whose escape from Haiti during that island's revolutionary destruction of slavery had brought her to Louisiana, carrying something far more valuable than money or property. She carried knowledge, the botanical expertise, the understanding of poisons and their applications, the pharmaceutical traditions preserved across African and Caribbean diaspora. All of this had been transmitted to young Eveline through demonstrations that began in her childhood, through whispered teachings that occurred in moments when white supervision was absent or inattentive. Celeste had taught her daughter not through written instruction, which was illegal for enslaved people to possess, but through the ancient method of apprenticeship, observation, participation, repetition, until knowledge became internalized in the body and mind simultaneously. The specific focus of Eveline's education was the aconite monkshood plant, known throughout centuries of African and Caribbean herbalist traditions as possessing properties that could be weaponized against oppressors who refused to recognize the legitimacy of enslaved people's humanity or their right to resist systematic brutality. The plant's alkaloids, chemical compounds called cardinolides, interfered directly with the electrical systems governing cardiac function, disrupting the precise coordination of electrical impulses that maintained the heart's rhythmic contractions. In small doses, aconite created sensations of numbness and tingling. In moderate doses, it produced cardiac arrhythmias that could be mistaken for natural disease progression. In concentrated doses, it caused sudden, catastrophic heart failure that appeared to observers as simple death from natural cardiac disease, death that white physicians of 1857 would attribute to pre-existing condition rather than to deliberate poisoning. The separation that had occurred when Eveline was 9 years old, when her owner had faced financial crisis and decided to liquidate enslaved property to preserve credit, had physically separated mother from daughter, but could not sever the intellectual inheritance that Celeste had managed to transmit during their years together. Eveline's memories of her mother's teachings, the specific knowledge about plant identification, extraction methodology, concentration techniques, and application timing had crystallized into precise understanding that she would spend the next 2 decades perfecting through years of work in various plantation kitchens, through careful observation of white doctors' failures to recognize poisoning symptoms, through private experimentation with small animals that she could obtain without raising suspicion. The years from 1835 to 1854, the period between her sale away from her mother and her acquisition by Eleanor Blackwell at auction, had constituted Eveline's practical education in deployment of botanical knowledge within plantation contexts. Each position she occupied had provided opportunities for learning, understanding how foods moved through plantation kitchens, how white supervision operated, what patterns of surveillance existed or failed to exist, how enslaved workers could coordinate actions without detection. She had developed relationships with other enslaved cooks in Savannah's planter circles, building networks of communication that transcended individual plantation boundaries and that allowed information to flow between properties in ways that white overseers never fully comprehended. When Eleanor Blackwell purchased Eveline in 1854, specifically because of her reputation as exceptional cook, paying premium prices for someone whose culinary skills could facilitate social entry into Savannah's elite circles, Eleanor believed she was acquiring valuable property that would enhance her status. Eleanor did not understand that she was acquiring someone whose 3-year residence at Thornfield would provide unprecedented opportunity for execution of plans that Eveline had been developing for decades. The moment of recognition had occurred early in Eveline's tenure at Thornfield, when Eleanor had begun mentioning her desire to host an extraordinary Thanksgiving celebration, a gathering so sophisticated and so impressively catered that it would permanently establish her authority within Savannah's planter aristocracy and silence any whispers about her capacity to manage a large plantation without male leadership. Eveline had understood immediately that Thanksgiving 1857 would create perfect circumstance for deployment of knowledge and planning that had accumulated over her entire life. The 3-year planning period had involved systematic preparation that demonstrated intelligence and organizational capability that contradicted every stereotype about enslaved women's supposed limitations. Eveline had begun identifying aconite plants growing wild in Georgia's mountainous regions, locations where plants grew abundantly enough that regular collection could occur without creating obvious gaps in wild populations. During annual trips that Eleanor occasionally authorized, trips ostensibly to collect medicinal herbs, but actually providing cover for acquisition of more lethal botanical materials, Eveline had gathered monkshood leaves and roots during peak growing seasons when alkaloid concentrations were highest. The extraction process had been conducted with extraordinary precision over months preceding the November banquet. Eveline had heated carefully measured quantities of dried plant material in water at specific temperatures for specific durations that would extract alkaloids without degrading their toxicity through excessive heat exposure. The resulting liquid, concentrated through evaporation conducted during nights when white supervision diminished, had produced small volumes of concentrate whose potency she had tested on animals she had acquired discreetly: a dog that had collapsed into cardiac arrhythmia and died within hours, a chicken that had displayed progressive weakness, culminating in sudden death. Small confirming experiments that validated her concentration levels had achieved necessary potency. The calibration of dosages that would be required for the actual conspiracy had demanded sophisticated understanding of human physiology combined with practical observation of the guests that Eleanor had invited to the Thanksgiving feast. Eveline had studied Eleanor's guest list carefully, understanding that the 75 invited guests represented heterogeneous population, men of different ages, different body weights, different health conditions, population that would require differential dosing integrated within feast that appeared uniform to white observers. She had identified which guests warranted the highest doses, the most brutal plantation owners, the political figures whose legislative decisions had shaped slavery policy, the military commanders responsible for suppressing enslaved resistance, and which guests would receive moderate or lower doses. The recruitment of additional conspirators had been conducted through networks that Eveline had developed gradually over years of kitchen work at various Savannah social events. Harriet, Sophie, and Margaret, Enslaved women working permanently at Thornfield had been approached carefully, with Eveline gradually revealing her intentions through discussions framed initially as abstract conversations about resistance and freedom before becoming increasingly concrete discussions about specific possibility of coordinated action during Eleanor's November celebration. Each of these women had possessed sufficient intelligence and moral clarity to understand what Eveline was proposing and sufficient commitment to participate, despite certainty that discovery would result in their torture and execution. The recruitment of women from neighboring plantations, Amanda from Whitmore, Julia from Lakeside, Catherine from Riverhaven, had been conducted with even greater caution, with information carefully compartmentalized, so that each woman understood only her specific role, without necessarily comprehending the full scope of what Eveline was orchestrating. Amanda needed training in identification of dishes that would receive poison. Julia needed understanding of precise timing for integration of toxins into specific foods. Catherine needed knowledge of positioning and comportment during the feast itself. The 3 years of preparation had culminated in November 1857, when Eveline and her conspirators began final preparations of concentrated poisons, final rehearsals of their roles, final psychological preparation for execution of conspiracy that would either represent the most successful act of enslaved resistance in American history or would result in their capture, torture, and execution once authorities understood what had occurred. The evening of November 26th had arrived with atmosphere of celebration and anticipation, white guests arriving in carriages, enslaved workers preparing final dishes in kitchen, Eleanor moving through mansion, making final preparations for moment that would cement her status as hostess of Georgia's most sophisticated gathering. What Eleanor did not understand was that she was preparing stage for event that would transform her name not into symbol of social triumph, but into symbol of how catastrophically vulnerable white supremacy actually was to resistance orchestrated by people whose invisibility white society took for granted. The 3-year transformation of Eveline Mason from kitchen servant into architect of mass conspiracy had required cultivation of relationships that transcended the boundaries that slavery attempted to enforce between enslaved people on different plantations. The communication networks that connected enslaved workers across Savannah's planter network had evolved over decades into sophisticated systems of information exchange that white authorities either failed to recognize or deliberately ignored, because acknowledging such networks would require admitting that enslaved people possessed organizational capabilities that contradicted foundational mythology about slavery's supposed control over enslaved population's capacity for coordinated action. Eveline's initial recruitment of conspirators began in early 1855, less than a year after she had arrived at Thornfield Plantation, when she first began comprehending the full scope of what Eleanor's social ambitions might enable. The first woman she approached was Harriet, who had worked in Thornfield's kitchen for 7 years, and whose intelligence and moral clarity had impressed Eveline during their first weeks working together. The conversation that initiated the conspiracy occurred during early morning hours when kitchen preparations were beginning and when white supervision was minimal, a conversation that Harriet would later describe to interrogators as seemingly abstract at first, focused on general frustrations with enslavement and theoretical discussions about what resistance might look like if conditions ever aligned for something dramatic to occur. "Harriet, do you ever think about what would happen if we had real power?" Eveline had asked one morning in March 1855, while they prepared dough for bread that would be served at Eleanor's dinner party that evening. "Not the kind of power they give us through control of kitchen work or through their trust in our loyalty, but real power, the power to make them understand what they have made us experience." Harriet had paused her work, knife suspended above the vegetables she had been preparing, and Eveline had observed the calculation occurring behind Harriet's eyes, the assessment of whether this conversation represented genuine conspiracy or represented test to determine her loyalty that might result in punishment if she expressed anything but absolute submission to her enslavement. "I think about things I shouldn't think about," Harriet had finally answered, her voice careful and measured. "But thinking is all I ever do. My thoughts haven't changed anything in 30 years of thinking. What if thinking wasn't all we did?" Eveline had pressed, revealing slightly more of what she was beginning to imagine. What if someone had knowledge about things that could create change? What if that knowledge could be deployed at moment when everyone with power was gathered in one place. The conversations that followed over subsequent weeks had gradually expanded Harriet's understanding of what Eveline was proposing. Not escape, which would have been quickly organized if either of them intended simply to flee Thornfield, but rather something far more ambitious and far more devastating. Eveline had shared fragments of information about botanical knowledge she possessed, about understanding of plants that grew in Georgia's mountainous regions, about techniques for extraction and concentration that her mother had taught her. She had moved from abstract discussions of resistance to concrete discussions of possibility, from theoretical conversations to practical planning that acknowledged that Thanksgiving 1857 would create unprecedented opportunity for coordinated action if sufficient preparation occurred during intervening years. Sophie and Margaret, the other two permanent kitchen workers at Thornfield, had been recruited through similar processes of gradual revelation during 1855 and 1856. Each conversation had been calibrated to Sarah's specific context and moral framework, with Eveline carefully assessing whether each woman possessed both the intelligence to understand what was being planned and the moral commitment to participate despite certainty of execution if discovery occurred. Sophie, who had been at Thornfield for only 3 years and who was still processing the trauma of separation from her daughter, who had been sold to a plantation in Alabama, had been approached through appeal to her desire for revenge against a system that had destroyed her family. Margaret, who was older and who had experienced decades of enslavement across multiple plantations, had been approached through appeal to her understanding that resistance through direct action represented final opportunity for justice that legal systems would never provide. By late 1855, Eveline had established a core group of 3 women committed to conspiracy, and she had begun the practical work of training them in their specific roles, while simultaneously beginning the botanical preparation that would extend across 2 years preceding the November 1857 banquet. The training involved teaching Sophie to identify and help gather aconite plants during Eleanor's authorized excursions to Georgia's mountain regions, teaching Margaret to understand the basics of extraction methodology so that she could assist with concentration processes, teaching Harriet to begin learning the calibration techniques that would eventually determine which dishes received which dosages of poison. The expansion of the conspiracy beyond Thornfield's permanent staff occurred during 1856 as Eveline began recruiting enslaved cooks from neighboring plantations through networks that had developed gradually during years of work together at Eleanor's social events. Amanda, who worked at Whitmore Plantation 3 miles from Thornfield, had been recruited through initial conversations about Eleanor's planned Thanksgiving celebration and about opportunity that magnitude of event would create for something unprecedented. Julia, from Lakeside Plantation, and Catherine from River Haven had been recruited through similar processes of careful revelation and gradual expansion of understanding about what Eveline was planning. The compartmentalization of information that Eveline employed demonstrated sophisticated understanding of operational security that would have impressed military strategists had it not been deployed by someone whom slavery systems insisted were intellectually incapable of strategic thinking. Amanda needed to understand only that certain dishes arriving at Thornfield would require special preparation and that she would be responsible for preparing specific components under Eveline's direction. Julia needed understanding of timing and coordination without necessarily comprehending the full scope of why precise timing mattered. Catherine needed to understand positioning and comportment during the feast without necessarily understanding what was happening in the dishes being served. Each conspirator knew only enough to execute her assigned function while remaining ignorant of details that could compromise entire conspiracy if any single person was captured and interrogated. The botanical preparation that extended across 1855 and 1856 involved field collection, extraction processing, and concentration techniques that required extraordinary attention to detail and extraordinary patience. Eveline had identified 7 locations in Georgia's mountainous regions where aconite monkshood grew in sufficient density to allow regular collection without creating obvious depletion. During Eleanor's authorized trips to mountain regions, trips that Eleanor believed were focused on collection of medicinal herbs for plantation use, Eveline had coordinated collection of hundreds of pounds of plant material that had been dried and preserved in hidden locations throughout Thornfield's grounds. The extraction process had been conducted during late evening hours when kitchen work had diminished and when white supervision was minimal. Eveline had heated carefully measured quantities of dried plant material in water at temperatures maintained within narrow range that would extract alkaloids without degrading their toxicity through excessive heat. The resulting liquid, bitter and slightly discolored, had been carefully transferred to glass containers for further concentration through evaporation process that extended across weeks, with liquid gradually reducing to smaller volumes of increasingly concentrated poison. The testing of potency had occurred through small-scale experiments that Eveline had conducted with laboratory precision, despite lacking any formal scientific training or institutional resources. A dog that Eleanor had acquired but had decided was unsuitable for breeding had been given small quantities of dilute extract, quantities calculated to produce symptoms but not immediate death. Eveline had carefully documented the time from ingestion to symptom onset, the progression of symptoms from initial numbness to cardiac distress to eventual collapse, the approximate time from ingestion to death. The exercise had allowed her to understand timing parameters that would be essential for orchestrating synchronized deaths during the Thanksgiving feast. The calibration of individual dosages had required Eveline to develop sophisticated understanding of human physiology, combined with practical knowledge about consumption patterns and individual variation in response to toxins. She had studied Eleanor's guest list with meticulous attention, noting ages, apparent health status, estimated body weights, and anticipated consumption patterns for each invited guest. She had understood that a 70-year-old man of substantial body weight would metabolize poison differently than a 40-year-old man of moderate build, that men with pre-existing cardiac conditions might succumb to smaller doses, while men in apparent good health might require higher concentrations to produce fatal results. The integration of poison into specific dishes represented exercise in artistic precision combined with deadly intention. Eveline had understood that dishes served collectively to all guests would produce uniform dosing, insufficient to reliably produce deaths in guests of varying weights and health status. Instead, she had planned for poison to be integrated into dishes that would be served preferentially to identified targets, cream sauces served on particular meats to specific guests, wine mixed with concentrated extract intended for consumption by particular individuals, dessert preparations that would receive doses calibrated to body weights of guests who she had designated as consuming those specific items. The psychological preparation of conspirators that extended across 3 years had represented crucial element often overlooked in traditional historical accounts of resistance movements. Eveline had understood that women committing to conspiracy, whose execution would result in their torture and death, required more than simple anger or abstract commitment to resistance. They required deep moral clarity that what they were planning was justice rather than simple murder, required understanding of historical context that positioned their actions within longer tradition of resistance across centuries of African diaspora, required emotional connection to larger purpose that transcended individual survival. Eveline had cultivated this psychological readiness through regular conversations with each conspirator that combined practical planning discussions with philosophical exploration of morality and justice. She had shared stories about her mother, Celeste, and about the Haitian Revolution, about how enslaved people had successfully destroyed slavery in Haiti through violence that had terrified European colonial powers. She had discussed specific instances of brutality that each conspirator had personally experienced or witnessed at Thornfield, the whippings Eleanor had administered, the separations of family members, the systematic destruction of humanity that slavery represented. She had placed these discussions within framework that positioned the conspiracy not as revenge, but as justice, as correction of moral universe that had been violated by slavery's systematic crimes. The final months preceding November 1857 had involved escalation of all preparation activities, while simultaneously maintaining absolute appearance of normalcy that would prevent white observers from detecting anything unusual about Thornfield's kitchen operations. The concentration of poison had reached its final stages by October 1857, with Eveline having refined extraction and concentration processes through repeated iterations to achieve consistency and potency that matched her calculated requirements for producing deaths within specific timeframes during the banquet. The integration of poison into actual feast preparations had required final rehearsals where Eveline had worked through exact procedures she would follow during November 26th, which dishes would receive poison, precise quantities that would be added, exact timing for preparation and serving. The coordinating of multiple conspirators in final weeks had been conducted through messages carried through enslaved communication networks, apparently innocent references to kitchen supplies or social gossip that actually conveyed operational information about timing, quantities, positioning. Amanda had been informed that she would need to transport certain materials from Lakeside to Thornfield on November 24th, materials that appeared to be ordinary foodstuffs, but that actually contained concentrated poison. Julia had been informed about positioning she would need to assume within Eleanor's kitchen during feast preparations. Catherine had been instructed regarding comportment and positioning during the actual serving of the meal. By November 1857, everything was prepared. 3 years of planning, 2 years of botanical preparation, months of extraction and concentration, weeks of final coordination had culminated in readiness to deploy conspiracy that would either transform resistance history or would result in executions that would attempt to deter others from contemplating similar acts. If this 3-year journey of Eveline's preparation, her careful recruitment of conspirators, her botanical mastery of extraction techniques, her psychological cultivation of commitment from women who understood they were planning their own deaths, has left you absolutely desperate to know exactly how the poisoning unfolded on November 26th, how Eveline orchestrated synchronized deaths among 52 of Georgia's white elite, and how she managed to escape into maroon communities while white authorities scrambled to understand what had occurred, then you need to hit that subscribe button right now and tell me in the comments exactly where you are watching from, because this story represents pinnacle of coordinated resistance that slavery's defenders insisted was impossible. Give this video a like, because algorithms reward engagement for content that challenges fundamental assumptions about who possessed intelligence, who possessed organizational capability, and who possessed moral clarity to understand that some systems deserve destruction regardless of personal cost. The evening of November 26, 1857, arrived with the kind of crystalline perfection that Eleanor Blackwell had orchestrated through months of planning. The grand dining room of Thornfield Mansion, illuminated by dozens of candles positioned within silver candelabra imported from London, the tables draped in linen so fine and so white that they seemed to glow with their own luminescence, the china and crystal and silver arranged with precision that reflected both Eleanor's aesthetic ambitions and her desire to demonstrate absolute control over every element of her household and her social position. The 75 guests who had accepted Eleanor's invitation represented concentration of power that rarely assembled in single location, state legislators whose votes shaped slavery policy for entire regions, federal judges whose decisions influenced commerce and law across territories, militia commanders whose security forces maintained control over enslaved populations across Georgia's vast agricultural regions, wealthy plantation owners whose cotton operations generated fortunes measured in hundreds of thousands of dollars that flowed through Savannah's commercial networks to Liverpool mills and European factories. The air in the dining room was thick with anticipation and with the aromas of dishes that Eleanor had commissioned Eveline to prepare, dishes so elaborate and so numerous that the serving alone would require assistance from enslaved cooks, brought specifically from neighboring plantations for this single evening of celebration. Eleanor herself moved through the dining room with bearing that reflected absolute certainty of her position and her authority, her black widow's dress transformed through careful tailoring and expensive jewelry into uniform of power rather than symbol of loss. She greeted each arriving guest with precisely calibrated warmth that acknowledged their importance while establishing that she remained absolute authority within her own household and within her own entertainment. The conversation throughout the dining room reflected confidence about slavery's permanence and prosperity, discussions of cotton prices that showed no sign of decline, discussions of new lands opening for cultivation in Western territories, discussions of political developments that seemed consistently to favor slavery's expansion and entrenchment within American economy and American political structure. What Eleanor could not have perceived, and what none of the assembled white guests could have comprehended, was that the very elaborateness of the feast that demonstrated her power and her control had been weaponized by someone she considered beneath notice into instrument of death, whose sophistication and coordination would ultimately challenge fundamental assumptions about who possessed intelligence, who possessed organizational capability, and who possessed moral authority to determine the boundaries of acceptable resistance against systems of oppression that appeared permanent and unquestionable. The serving began at 8 o'clock in the evening, with enslaved servants beginning to circulate among the dining room, presenting the first course. An elaborate display of cold preparations that Eleanor had specified, dishes intended to demonstrate both her wealth and her access to foodstuffs that required extraordinary preparation and extraordinary expense. But beneath the aesthetic surface of these opening dishes, Eveline's poison had already been integrated in carefully calibrated quantities into specific preparations that had been designed to be served preferentially to identified targets. At precisely 8:47 in the evening, as recorded in a letter written by one of the few survivors of the catastrophe, Georgia State Legislator Henry Warrington, a man in his 60s whose previous ownership of over 300 enslaved people made him particularly repugnant to Eveline's moral calculus, began to experience first symptoms of aconite poisoning that would culminate in his death within hours. The symptoms began subtly, a sensation of numbness in his lips and tongue that Warrington initially attributed to the intense spice in the cold preparations he had recently consumed. He reached for wine to wash away the sensation, wine into which Eveline had introduced additional concentrated poison hours earlier, when Eleanor's white servants were occupied with other preparations. The liquid burned down his throat, not alleviating but intensifying the symptoms that were beginning to transform from mild discomfort into something far more ominous. The cardiac involvement began approximately 15 minutes after Warrington's initial symptoms, his heart beginning to beat with irregular rhythm that manifested a sensation of palpitations, of his heartbeat becoming suddenly erratic and powerful enough that he could feel it in his chest and throat with alarming intensity. He loosened his collar, seeking relief from sensation of constriction that was beginning to develop, seeking fresh air that seemed somehow insufficient to provide adequate oxygen, despite the room being well ventilated and positioned to receive evening breezes from Thornfield's gardens. "Are you well, sir?" One of the enslaved servants, a young woman named Grace who was entirely unaware of the poisoning occurring within the feast she was serving, asked with concern, noting that Warrington appeared suddenly distressed. Warrington attempted to assure her that he was experiencing nothing more than temporary discomfort related to the richness of the meal, a lie that was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as cardiac arrhythmias intensified and as he began to experience sensation of his chest being constricted by unseen force that was squeezing his lungs and preventing him from drawing adequate breath. By 9:02 in the evening, Warrington collapsed from his chair entirely, his body convulsing violently as electrical disturbances in his cardiac tissue reached levels that prevented meaningful contraction of his heart muscle. The screams that erupted from nearby guests at sight of the legislator's collapse were the first indication to Eleanor that something profoundly wrong was occurring, that the evening of triumph she had planned was transforming into medical emergency that would consume attention and that would dominate conversation for years to come. The physicians who were present among the gathered guests, there were always physicians present at such gatherings, because men of power wanted assurance that medical assistance would be available if needed, rushed to Warrington's side with instruments and with all the medical knowledge that 1857 could provide, knowledge that proved entirely inadequate for diagnosing or treating poisoning with botanical toxins that white physicians' educational traditions had not equipped them to recognize. Warrington died at 9:34 in the evening, his heart finally ceasing to beat in any coordinated rhythm whatsoever, his body going rigid and then slack in the sequence characteristic of cardiac death. The shock of his death in Eleanor's dining room, on the very evening when she was supposedly demonstrating her mastery of entertainment and social protocol, would have been dramatic enough by itself to transform the evening into disaster. But what was about to unfold would make a single death seem trivial in comparison to cascade of collapses that would soon begin occurring with terrifying regularity throughout the dining room. The timing of additional poisoned dishes coordinated perfectly with the pattern of symptom progression that Eveline had calculated through months of experimentation and observation. Within 30 minutes of Warrington's collapse, at 9:15, 9:23, 9:31, and 9:37, 5 additional guests began experiencing initial symptoms of poisoning, their faces suddenly showing expressions of alarm and confusion as numbness began in their lips and extremities, as their hearts began exhibiting arrhythmias that manifested as sensations of palpitation and chest constriction. These men were positioned throughout the dining room at sufficient distance from each other that their simultaneous distress created initial impression that multiple medical emergencies were occurring independently rather than that coordinated poisoning was unfolding. Eleanor's response to the medical crises erupting throughout her dining room oscillated between shock, denial, and desperate attempts to maintain control over a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond any possibility of control. She attempted to summon the enslaved household staff to assist the afflicted guests, attempted to organize removal of the suffering men to locations where they could be more comfortably attended, attempted to preserve appearance of authority and command, despite the obvious catastrophe unfolding before her eyes. The enslaved servants moved through the chaos with expressions of shock that appeared entirely genuine because only Eveline and the specific conspirators who had prepared poisoned dishes possessed knowledge of what was actually occurring. Eveline herself remained visible throughout the dining room, performing her function as kitchen manager, supervising service of the remaining courses, her face expressing appropriate concern about the medical emergencies occurring among the guests, while internally acknowledging that the conspiracy was unfolding exactly as planned, and that white observers' assumption that these deaths represented isolated medical incidents rather than coordinated poisoning would persist for critical hours that would allow her conspirators to complete their roles and begin escape sequences that had been planned meticulously across 3 years of preparation. The mathematical progression of poisonings that developed over subsequent hours reflected Eveline's extraordinary precision in dose calibration and timing coordination. By 10 hours in the evening, 12 guests had collapsed into various stages of cardiac distress. By 10:30, the number had reached 23, with multiple men simultaneously experiencing the progression of symptoms that would culminate in their deaths. The physicians present at Eleanor's gathering found themselves overwhelmed by volume of medical emergencies they were being asked to manage simultaneously, and they found themselves struggling to identify any commonality among the afflicted that might suggest unified cause rather than multiple independent medical events. The hypothesis that began emerging among the physicians by 10:45 in the evening, that poisoning had occurred, came almost too late to be acted upon in any meaningful way that might have prevented additional deaths. The physicians began questioning enslaved servants about contents of food being served, began examining remaining dishes for visible evidence of contamination, began asking whether any guests had mentioned tasting anything unusual or detecting any evidence of foreign materials in their food. But Eveline had been far too sophisticated in her methodology to leave evidence that casual examination could detect. The poison had been integrated into dishes in forms that left no visible residue, no taste detectable to palates not attuned specifically to aconite's subtle, bitter character, no evidence whatsoever that poisoning rather than simple misfortune had occurred. The ensuing panic that consumed Eleanor's dining room as realization spread that intentional poisoning had occurred represented transformation of what had begun as evening of triumph into scene of absolute horror and chaos. The remaining guests who had not yet consumed sufficiently poisoned food to be affected by poisoning attempted to determine whether they were potentially among targets of conspiracy, attempted to identify any remaining food items that were safe to consume, attempted to organize departure from Thornfield before they themselves became victims of conspiracy whose scope they could not yet comprehend. Some guests attempted to organize armed response, attempted to identify who might be responsible for poisoning, attempted to establish whether enslaved people within Thornfield might be organizing insurrection that had chosen the form of mass poisoning as its method of resistance. The cascade of deaths that continued through the night following initial collapse of Warrington occurred with terrible regularity as additional guests succumbed to effects of aconite poisoning that had been carefully calibrated to produce death within specific time frames that Eveline had calculated through her experimental work on animal subjects and through her study of extraction potency and concentration levels. Some guests died quietly, their deaths marked simply by cessation of breathing and heartbeat. Others died in agony, their deaths accompanied by screams that terrified the surviving guests and that created atmosphere of absolute nightmare surrounding Eleanor's grand celebration that was transforming into nightmare beyond any possibility of containment or control. By 11:30 in the evening, 18 guests were dead. By 1 in the morning of November 27th, the count had reached 34 deaths. By 3 in the morning, 47 guests had died, and additional deaths were still occurring among those who had consumed extremely high dosages of poison that was producing extended death scenes, extending across hours of progressive cardiac deterioration. The enslaved servants who had been brought to Thornfield specifically to assist with serving the feast were themselves experiencing horror at witnessing death on such massive scale, and most were completely innocent of knowledge regarding the conspiracy that was occurring around them. Their terror at seeing white guests dying en masse, their fear about how they themselves would be blamed for catastrophe that they had not planned or anticipated, their recognition that massive punishment would inevitably follow discovery of what had occurred. All of this manifested in expressions of shock and confusion that appeared entirely genuine because it was entirely genuine. The medical personnel present at the gathering eventually concluded that the only possible explanation for the scale of death occurring was indeed coordinated poisoning. But they remained entirely unable to identify the poison or its source because aconite leaves no trace that 1857 medical science possessed capability to detect. The autopsy work that would begin the following morning would reveal cardiac tissue damage consistent with extreme electrical disturbance, but would provide no evidence pointing toward specific toxin or toward specific responsible parties. The investigation that white authorities would begin within hours of first recognizing that systematic poisoning had occurred would struggle with fundamental problem that no one could positively identify what had been used to kill the guests. No one could determine with certainty who had access to whatever poison had been deployed, and no one could understand how conspiracy of such sophistication could have been orchestrated within household where enslaved people were supposedly completely monitored and completely controlled. The escape that Eveline had orchestrated began as chaos of the evening was reaching its apex, as Eleanor was attempting to organize response to catastrophe, as physicians were struggling to provide treatment for poisoning whose cause they could not identify, as guests who remained alive were attempting to organize departure from Thornfield or to secure themselves against possibility of additional poisoning. Eveline simply disappeared from kitchen areas, slipping away from Thornfield through routes she had reconnoitered extensively during 3 years of residence at the plantation. The direction of her flight took her northward away from Savannah toward Georgia's mountain regions, where maroon communities maintained autonomous settlements in wilderness areas that white authorities rarely penetrated. The network of assistance that had been established through enslaved communication channels would facilitate her journey north, would provide shelter and supplies and guidance toward communities where she could find sanctuary among people who understood that what she had accomplished represented act of ultimate resistance against slavery that had appeared unshakable and unquestionable. Margaret was captured within 3 days of the poisoning when militia forces systematically searched surrounding plantations seeking enslaved suspects. Sophie was apprehended 5 days after poisoning when white authorities traced her movements to location where she was attempting to reach underground networks that might transport her toward free states. Harriet remained at large for 2 weeks before being discovered hiding in plantation structures on Lakeside Estate, before being forcibly returned to Thornfield under heavy guard where she was imprisoned pending trial. The capture of these 3 conspirators provided authorities with names and locations of other women involved in conspiracy, leading to apprehension of Amanda, Julia, and Catherine within weeks of November 26th. By November 30th, 1857, just 4 days after the poisoning, the death count had stabilized at 52 victims, making the Thornfield Banquet of Death the largest successful poisoning conspiracy in American history, conducted by enslaved people against white victims. The scale of the death toll and the sophistication of coordination that had been required to accomplish it would terrify Georgia's planter society and would force acknowledgement that enslaved people possessed capabilities for resistance that white supremacy had insisted were impossible. The morning of November 27, 1857, revealed landscape of devastation that Georgia authorities had never before encountered. 52 bodies scattered throughout Thornfield Mansion and its grounds. 52 men who had represented some of Georgia's most powerful political, economic, and military leadership now lying dead or dying from toxin that medical science could not identify and could not treat. The immediate response from Georgia's governing structures was mobilization of military forces, arrest of multiple enslaved people from Thornfield and neighboring plantations, and initiation of investigation designed not so much to understand what had occurred as to identify perpetrators who could be punished with sufficient severity to deter others from contemplating similar conspiracies against white authority. The interrogation of enslaved people began within hours of authorities recognizing that systematic poisoning rather than natural medical emergency had occurred. Eleanor herself, traumatized by the catastrophe that had transformed her moment of social triumph into personal nightmare, was unable to provide meaningful information about how poisoning could have occurred within her own kitchen under her supervision. She insisted repeatedly that Eveline had been loyal servant, that there had been no indication of disloyalty or resistance, that she could not possibly understand how someone she trusted had orchestrated death of 52 people without Eleanor detecting anything unusual about behavior or activities. The investigation that unfolded over subsequent weeks focused intense scrutiny on Eveline and on the other identified conspirators whose names gradually emerged through combination of interrogation of captured conspirators and through testimony of enslaved people who had observed suspicious activities but who had not understood their significance when they were occurring. Margaret's interrogation produced names of other women involved: Harriet, Sophie, Amanda, Julia, Catherine. Harriet's interrogation under torture produced confirmation of basic planning framework while providing insufficient detail to allow authorities to fully understand scope of conspiracy that had been coordinated across 3 years of meticulous preparation. The trials that followed captured poisonings occurred with extraordinary speed, reflecting Georgia's determination to demonstrate that justice could be administered swiftly and thoroughly to enslaved people who committed crimes against white persons. Margaret was tried first in December 1857, facing charges of conspiracy to murder and of actual participation in mass poisoning that had killed 52 people. The prosecution's case relied primarily on Margaret's own confession, extracted through torture and interrogation, confession that established basic outline of conspiracy without revealing sophisticated details about botanical knowledge or 3-year planning process that had preceded the November 26 banquet. Margaret's testimony during trial, testimony extracted under circumstances where alternative to cooperation was torture and death regardless, provided authorities with narrative they needed to demonstrate that poisoning had been deliberately orchestrated by enslaved conspirators acting with apparent intention to strike at Georgia's planter elite. Her testimony confirmed that Eveline had been primary architect of conspiracy. That planning had extended across 3 years. That poison had been integrated into feast preparations through coordinated actions of multiple women acting on Eveline's instructions. But Margaret's testimony under intense pressure to provide incriminating details was incomplete and fragmented, providing authorities with understanding that conspiracy was far more sophisticated than they had initially believed, while leaving gaps in knowledge about how botanical poisoning had been conducted or how Eveline had developed the expertise necessary to execute sophisticated toxicological operations. The trial of Harriet occurred in January 1858, with her testimony adding additional details to picture that authorities were constructing of the conspiracy. Harriet revealed more about Eveline's background, about her mother Celeste, who had taught her botanical knowledge, about the 3-year planning process that had involved recruitment of conspirators and gathering of botanical materials and extraction of poisons. But Harriet's testimony remained incomplete regarding technical details of how poisons had been extracted and concentrated and calibrated to produce deaths within specific timeframes, information that Harriet simply did not possess because Eveline had carefully compartmentalized knowledge so that no single conspirator understood complete process. The execution of Margaret occurred in February 1858, with hanging conducted in Savannah as public spectacle designed to demonstrate that enslaved resistance would be punished with complete finality. The execution was attended by thousands of white spectators who had come to observe death of someone who had participated in conspiracy that had killed white men of prominence, attendees who understood that Margaret's death represented attempt by white authority to restore order and control over enslaved population after conspiracy had revealed vulnerabilities in slavery's security systems that authorities preferred not to acknowledge. Margaret maintained dignity throughout her execution, showing neither fear nor remorse, acknowledging on the gallows that what she and Eveline had done was justified response to slavery's crimes against enslaved people. The execution of Harriet followed in March 1858, with similar public attendance and similar attempt by authorities to use her death as lesson to enslaved people about futility of resistance and about certainty of punishment for those who participated in conspiracies against white authority. Harriet's final words on the gallows, according to multiple accounts, indicated moral clarity about righteousness of what the conspirators had planned and executed. "We did what justice demanded, even though your laws punish it as crime. God knows the truth about what we did and why we did it." The capture and trial of Sophie occurred in April 1858, with her testimony adding additional fragments to picture that authorities were assembling about conspiracy. The executions of Amanda, Julia, and Catherine followed in May and June of 1858, each woman facing death for participation in conspiracy that had killed 52 white people, and that represented greatest threat to slavery's apparent stability in years. The cascade of trials and executions extended across first half of 1858, with Georgia's legal system processing captured conspirators through courts that moved with extraordinary speed toward predetermined conclusions, conviction and execution for anyone who had participated in poisoning conspiracy. But Eveline herself remained uncaptured, having successfully escaped into Georgia's mountain regions, where maroon communities provided shelter and protection for fugitives from slavery. The escape routes that she had planned so carefully during 3 years of residence at Thornfield had functioned exactly as intended, with networks of enslaved people providing assistance and guidance that allowed her to flee northward, away from Savannah's militia and law enforcement networks. The attempts by white authorities to pursue Eveline into mountain wilderness proved unsuccessful because maroon communities understood survival required absolute protection of fugitives from slavery, required cooperation across enslaved networks that white people could not infiltrate or comprehend. The investigation into exact composition of poisons used during Banquet progressed only incompletely, hampered by fact that aconite's botanical origins and its specific properties were not widely known among white medical professionals who lacked training in recognizing plant toxins that grew abundantly in Georgia's natural environment. Multiple white physicians who had been present at Thornfield during night of poisoning spent months attempting to identify toxin that had killed guests, but without understanding of what specific poison had been used, they could only make educated guesses based on symptom patterns that they observed in surviving victims and in testimonies about symptom progression from those who had attended dying guests. The toxicological knowledge that would have been necessary to definitively identify aconite as poisoning agent existed nowhere within Georgia's medical establishment in 1857 because such knowledge was preserved in African and Caribbean healing traditions that white medical establishments dismissed as superstition and as primitive ignorance unworthy of serious scientific attention. The irony that sophisticated botanical poisoning conducted through aconite deployment succeeded specifically because white medical science lacked understanding of poisons that grew wild in their own environment represented one of many ways that Eveline's conspiracy exploited vulnerabilities inherent in supremacist systems that claimed superiority while remaining ignorant of traditional knowledge systems developed across centuries of African diaspora. The legacy of Thornfield Banquet of Death extended far beyond the 52 deaths and the trials and executions that followed, reaching into broader consciousness of both white and enslaved populations throughout Georgia and throughout the South. For enslaved communities, the story of Eveline Mason and her conspirators represented proof that sophisticated resistance was possible, despite overwhelming power of slavery systems that appeared permanent and unquestionable. The narrative of Eveline's escape and her presumed sanctuary within maroon communities circulated through enslaved communication networks as confirmation that complete resistance was achievable, that resistance could assume forms that slavery's defenders had not anticipated, that enslaved people possessed capabilities for coordinated intelligent action that contradicted every claim white supremacy made about enslaved people's supposed limitations. For white planter elite, the poisoning conspiracy represented terrifying vulnerability in slavery's security systems that no amount of additional surveillance or additional control could adequately address. If 52 of Georgia's most powerful men could be killed by poison, integrated into food prepared within white household by enslaved workers supposedly under constant supervision. Then slavery's fundamental claim to provide security and control for white population was revealed as fiction. The paranoia that the poisoning inspired within Georgia's planter circles manifested in increased surveillance of enslaved workers in kitchens, in restrictions on enslaved people's movements and communications, in attempted innovations in security systems designed to prevent similar conspiracies, while being fundamentally incapable of preventing resistance conducted through knowledge systems that white people did not understand and could not detect. The spread of Thornfield Banquet narrative throughout enslaved communities of the South created legends and oral traditions that preserved memory of Evelyn's accomplishment across generations. Enslaved people who had never met Evelyn learned her story through conversation and through communication networks that connected enslaved communities across geographic boundaries that white authorities attempted to enforce. The figure of Eveline, the cook whose botanical knowledge and 3-year patience had culminated in death of 52 white oppressors, became symbol of resistance that operated through intelligence and planning rather than through direct violent confrontation. The story circulated in forms that emphasized Evelyn's genius, her sophistication, her moral clarity about righteousness of what she had planned and executed, her ultimate escape from white capture and white punishment. The historical record of Thornfield Banquet of Death became fragmented and obscured in years following 1858, as Georgia's historical communities and white chroniclers attempted to minimize or deny the magnitude of what had occurred. Some accounts reduced the death toll, suggesting that fewer than the established 52 deaths had actually occurred. Some accounts emphasized incompleteness of authorities' understanding about conspirators and claimed that full scope of conspiracy had never been definitively established. Some accounts downplayed the sophistication of Eveline's botanical knowledge, suggesting that the poisoning had been more accidental than intentional, or that the conspiracy had been less carefully planned than historical evidence actually indicated. The effort to diminish Thornfield Banquet's historical significance represented an attempt to contain threat to slavery's narrative about its own security and stability that the actual facts of the conspiracy posed. Modern historical scholarship examining documentation of Thornfield Banquet and the subsequent trials has confirmed that the poisoning conspiracy represents one of the most sophisticated acts of enslaved resistance documented in pre-Civil War American history, representing planning and coordination and technical expertise that contradicts fundamental assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities that dominated both antebellum and post-emancipation historical narratives. The reconstruction of Eveline's botanical knowledge through examination of trial testimony, through investigation of what methods would have been necessary to extract and concentrate aconite poisons to potency levels that would produce reliably fatal results, through analysis of how multiple conspirators could have been coordinated to act simultaneously without discovery. All of this demonstrates intelligence and organizational capability that slavery's defenders insisted enslaved people could not possibly possess. The fate of Eveline herself remains partially obscured by historical records limitations and by deliberate attempts to suppress information about her escape and sanctuary within Maroon communities. What is established is that she successfully evaded capture immediately following November 26, 1857, that she reached mountain sanctuaries where Maroon communities provided protection, and that she remained at large despite intensive efforts by Georgia militia forces to pursue and capture her. Some historical accounts suggest that Evelyn lived for several decades following her escape, that she shared knowledge of botanical toxicology with other Maroon community members, and that she became figure of reverence within enslaved and Maroon communities who understood her as having accomplished what few people achieved: successful escape, successful evasion of white capture, and successful accomplishment of revenge conspiracy that had inflicted catastrophic damage on white supremacy's most visible representatives. The broader historical significance of Thornfield Banquet of Death extends beyond the specific events of November 1857 to influence how historians understand possibilities for resistance within slavery systems, how we comprehend